Here's my listing for the top 5 reasons why 90s Disney was so successful. In at number 1, quality storytelling. Something about Disney from the 80s, 60s, 70s, wherever you want to look back into the past before the 90s, I think there was some common theme that you had a great gem every once in a decade. In each of those 10 years or so, like the 80s, you had The Little Mermaid. 70s, you had maybe like Robin Hood, that's the one that rings a bell from that year. And you can go back and look through, and it's like one great movie per decade. The odd time you'd maybe get 2. But the 90s managed to do something never done before and had like 3, 4, 5 great classic Disney movies that you probably still now at your age, would go back and rewatch in a heartbeat. I think there's a whole reason why that is, and that's great storytelling. I think in the 60s, 70s, and maybe part of the 80s, they were more focusing on just being an entertaining cartoon, just having the background, and not being a film to just sit in awe of. And I think that switched at the back end of the 80s with The Little Mermaid. And I don't know why The Little Mermaid changes that thing and everything after that, a knock-on effect where that's the perfect template. That was then photocopied basically throughout the whole of the 90s Disney films, because all of them are practically the same thing. Great villain, great story, great, there's the music in it's fantastic, in which most of those points I'm going to touch on later on. But the main story of it, that's the core of it, and they focused on that. And when you focus on that, instead of going, oh, that's a pretty cool cartoon, look at the animation, that's fantastic, but the rest of the film is boring as fuck, I would rather have a film that is really, really good storytelling but bad animation than the other way around. And I think that's what Disney focused on and went, look, this is what we need to focus on. And that's what The Little Mermaid did so well, and that was a great kick-starting point for the 90s Disney. In at number 2, musical orientated. What I mean by musical orientated is if you look back at the past before the 90s, you had some great Disney movies, and what makes them classics is most of the time the music that they use in them. Like Fantasia, people rate that as a huge film, even though I'm not a fan. It's just full of music, and then Mickey Mouse running across the screen. You've got likes of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs singing the Seven Dwarfs song, and I think that is iconic, and that made the film better. If you take out those musical components, that film wouldn't be half as good. And you could go through it. Robin Hood, I think there's some great music in that as well. It would take away the enjoyment levels of those particular films. Black Cauldron missed probably a soundtrack of sorts or musical elements in there to make the movie seem more entertaining. And I think you could pick any movie from the 80s. I'd just pick Black Cauldron because it's one I've watched a few times now. You could pick any movie from the 80s, apart from 1989's Little Mermaid, and you could improve that by adding music in there. And imagine now, looking into the 90s, which is our main point, is if you're looking at The Lion King, imagine that without music. Imagine Aladdin without music, Tarzan. The movies just wouldn't feel the same. And I think that musical elements that got added into those films just really lifted it, made it more magical. And I think adding that in is a reason why 90s Disney became something quite lovable. In at number 3, bigger and badder villains. If you just look at the 90s villains, Scar, Jafar, just to name those 2, they were phenomenal. And even though some of the 90s movies don't have what you call really big villains, the 2 that I mentioned there are basically like 2 of the greatest Disney villains of all time. And to have them in one decade, that is phenomenal. And there's ones that I'm not even remembering right now, just trying to rush through this listing. But I think that if you look back again, like to the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, you probably had one great villain in each of those decades, and that's about it. Like we mentioned with the film quality in those. And I think with the 90s, they looked at what do we need? And I think the greatest films of all time, whether they're animated or not animated, have always got a great villain. You can't even look past Die Hard without thinking of Hans Gruber. You can't look at Home Alone without thinking of Harry and Marv. I know I've gone Christmas there, but it's just that general thing. They're the first things that popped into my head. And you can't think of Star Wars without Darth Vader. Those villains are iconic and make those films iconic. And that's why most of the Disney movies in the 80s, apart from Little Mermaid, just do not stand out, because the villains are just alright. They're just like the Horned King in the Black Cauldron is just something where he would be a great villain if the story awarded it to be a great villain. and could have been used as a great villain, but didn't really do anything to make that villain interesting. And this goes on to a point that I'm going to make later, but I think that's where the character development of the villain, how can you make that villain more callous and evil so that you're genuinely booing him through the telly and going, I absolutely hate your guts. And I think that's what you want in every type of film, really. That's your genuine opinion. Obviously, if it's not that type of genre of film, like if you're doing a comedy film, I don't think necessarily speaking you need a quote-unquote villain. I don't think that's necessarily needed. But I think if you're making something like this or a superhero film or something like that, you need a badass villain to create that antagonist versus protagonist sort of storyline going on. And I think that's what really worked in the 90s. In at number 4, great character development. I think this is crucial for any type of film that you're making. It's got to have great character development, but especially in animation movies, because you've got to ask, what makes Simba great? What is unique about Tarzan? What is so lovable about Aladdin? Those characters in particular. What makes them so special? Hercules, what makes him so special? If there's nothing special about those characters, you're not going to enjoy that film. Like with Simba, you're watching somebody kill his dad and him getting the blame for it, and you're feeling sorry for him. Then he moves away and then comes back, and you're just getting behind the protagonist all the time, and you're wanting to hate the antagonist even more. And I think that evolves into all the 90s films, of that constant character development that goes on in those films. This is what was missing out of a few of the 80s films, because I know I keep dissing Black Cauldron, but it is one of the weakest films in Disney history, I think. And a big problem with that character development in the Black Cauldron is if you look at the main kid, I can't even remember his name. If you look at him, he just looks like the guy out the Sword and the Stone. And there's nothing special about him. There's nothing that stands out about him, even though he's the main character. And you could go through several characters and go, why are you so special? What can you do that can either pluck on the heartstrings, or you can get behind and not get behind somebody else? And if you can't, then there's something wrong. And it's not just that with character development as well. I think that in the 90s, you saw a lot more of love relationships in there as well. Look at it. Aladdin and Jasmine, you've got Simba and Nala, you've got all these great, and then Tarzan and Jane as well. You've got all these different kind of relationships building, which weren't really a thing. You'd get like in, I don't know, Snow White and Seven Dwarfs, where you'd get the prince hooking up with Snow White at the end of the film, which that was it. There was no real connection. It weren't like they built it up all over the film. They just got together. In at number 5, crisp animation. And I know earlier I mentioned how animation used to be the main focus, and to even say that it's one of the reasons why the 90s Disney was so successful is because they crispened it up, and it was more like the cherry on top of the cake. It weren't the main focus, and alone on this list it would not look great. However, if you put it alongside like the stories that's improved over the tenure in the 90s, the soundtracks, and you go down that listing that we've gone through so far, the 5th one just is like the icing on top of the cake. It's clearly something that really improved in the 90s, because if you look in the Lion King, there was no weird lines or blurry parts on the screen. You had crisp image. You could tell the story and see the characters with so much detail on them, and that animation style got used up all the way to like 2004, 2005, whenever Chicken Little came out. That changed it, I think. That might have been the last one, and Atlantis used a little bit of a different one as well, but it was sort of like a merge of the two styles. Obviously, Toy Story in the Pixar universe came in and brought in a new type of animation, but I think this animation style for the Disney classics to tell the story this way was fantastic with The Lion King and Aladdin. I think just by updating it and making the characters look crisper and look more 3D and jumping out at you a little bit more, it just created a better environment for these films to succeed. Certain films back in the day I struggle to watch because the quality isn't that great, whereas in the 90s you can go back and watch any one of those films and the quality actual visually is pretty fucking good. And like I said, I think the story is more important, But if you have crisp imagery as well, that can really balance it to make it one of the greatest films of all time. So there's my listing. What are your thoughts on those choices that I put in my top 5 reasons why the 90s Disney was so successful? Do you disagree with any? Do you agree with any? And let me know down in the comments. Or do you want to add any other reasons to why 90s Disney was so successful? Comment that down in the comments down below. If you haven't done so already, hit that like button. That would be much appreciated if you've enjoyed this video. And if you haven't done so already, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and I shall see you fine folks in the next one. Laters.